So to recap, in the first task we learned how to create a basic form, how to add some validation constraints, how to fill a form with data, for example if you edit data from the database, as we did, how to submit the form, how to store the modified data. Yeah, basically that was it. Are there any questions on that part so far? All right. If you have any questions, please just ask. So the second topic that we will learn is object-based forms. So what we did in the first task, we had this good object, and from the good object we created an array that we filled into the form, and when we submitted the form we received the updated array and used that array to update the good object, right, to call the setters. That's kind of a lot of duplication, especially if you have big objects with a lot of different properties. That's a lot of code just for creating the array and for updating the object again in the end. So Symfony has a concept called object-based forms. You can, instead of creating an array, directly access the object from the form. And instead of reading the array indices, the form will call the getters of the object and call the setters. Or if you don't have getters and setters, the form can also access public properties. That's called an object-based form. And that's saving a lot of code in your controller and making everything much shorter than we had it in the beginning. And basically, creating an object-based form is the same thing as the forms that we had so far. But we have to configure the form to modify objects of a given class. So every object-based form is an object-based form for a specific class of domain model. So we have to pass options to the create form builder methods. Basically all the methods in the form library that we use to create forms, to create fields, accept this array of options. It's always the same. So when we call create form builder, we pass the option data class and set it to the class of the good that we want to modify. All right? So we create this options array, we pass it, the rest remains the same. We add all the fields and then we receive the form. So that's the only difference here. When we add the fields, this time the names of the fields don't correspond to the keys in the array, but to the names of the setters and getters. So Symfony will just take the names, prepend set and get, and try to find these getters and setters on the object. For example, set name and get name, set price and get price. In this case though, good does not have the get price and set price methods, but set price per ton and get price per ton. For these cases where the fields in the form for some reason need to have a different name than the getters and setters in your object, you can use the property path option and specify the property that the field should access. So in this case, the price field will not use set price and get price, but set price per ton and get price per ton. This also works for array-based forms, when you have a name of a field that does not correspond, or that corresponds to a different key in the array. You can use the same option to configure that. Okay? If we want to fill a form with the data of an existing object, there are a couple of ways to do that. The first one is to pass the object to the create form builder method. You saw that before we used null, so there was no default data and the options. We can just pass the object that we want to modify, or we can call set data as before. Before we pass an array to set data, now we pass an object since it's an object-based form. Or instead of on the builder, we can call set data on the form that we receive in the end. from the builder. And if we want to change the values of individual fields, then you would usually just change the default values in your class and pass a new good instance to a form, and then the values of the different properties that you set in your model will be used as default values in the form. And as you can imagine, that's a very good way to remove duplication in your code, because you don't have to set a default value both in your domain model and in the forms. And if you change the default values in one place, you don't have to change them in the other place. You just set properties and default values once in your model, and the form will automatically take these values by default as well. Of course, you can override them. To receive the submitted and changed good instance, you can just call getData on the form. This will return the good that was modified. Since you specified the data class option on the form object is even able to create new instances by itself. So it will, if you don't pass any default data like here, if you just say null, then the form will try to just create a new good instance with an empty constructor without arguments. That doesn't work anymore if the constructor has default, his required arguments, of course. You receive the good, and then you can just do anything with the updated good instance. You can also move the constraints that we have in the form to the model. One way to do that, there's a couple of ways, but one way to do that is to use annotations. So you will use the same classes that we used in the controller before and that we passed to the constraints option. But this time, instead of using it in the controller, you can use these classes to annotate the properties in your model. Or you can even annotate the getters directly. And you see the syntax is a little bit different. If you used doctrine before, you're familiar with that, it's the same syntax. What we usually do in Symfony is that we create an alias for this namespace. So the constraints namespace is the namespace that contains all the constraints. And we just alias that as assert, so that you don't have to import every individual constraint, but you just import the namespace once, and then you can just use that namespace and use different constraints in that namespace without adding more use statements in the beginning of the file. That's especially for the Sublime Text users. Very nice. All right. Any questions about this? So the second task for you would be to take the form from the first task and make the modifications that I just showed to you. To, instead of making it an array-based form, making it an object-based form. And to move all the constraints to the model that we have in the controller right now. So basically what you need to do is you need to pass the data class option to the form builder. You can probably just leave the fields as they were before. You need to pass the existing or a new good instance, depending if it's the new form or the edit form, to the builder as default data. You can also change the default values of the properties in the good instance. And then you need to persist the good created by the form with doctrine and save it. In the end, you can try to move all the constraints to the model and see how that works and if it works. All right? Once you're finished with that task, I would like to think about the benefits and drawbacks of both ways, like object-based and array-based. Like, when would you use one, when would you use the other? whereas like the different down and upsides. Okay? And Antonio will help you, and I will help you as well if you have any questions. This should be fairly simple to ask, to use, to complete. So we have the controller that we used before. You remember that we had the create edit form and create form. And the common code is extracted to create good form builder method. Okay? So as you see, create form. We'll go to full screen here. This one uses the goods create action. It uses some default data and has a create submit button. And create edit form uses an existing good instance, uses the goods update action, a put method, and has a submit button that is named differently. Okay? And if we go to create good form builder, that's the next method. Here we just have the definition of the fields and the constraints. Now, as I showed you before, there's basically 3 steps required to convert the array-based form into an object-based form. The first step was to configure the option data class and pass it to create form builder, which is here. So let's create the options array, set data class to deeps. That's the class of the good instance. Here's the default value of the form. We leave it at null for now. And the options. That's the first step. Now the form builder knows that it's not modifying an array, but an instance of class good. All right. I hope that works for you. If it doesn't, I will change the color scheme later on. So we configured the form to modify, to pass that data class option. The second step is we need to pass the good instance to the form that we want to modify, right? Because I told you that the form is now using the getters and setters of the good class. So let's pass an object of the class good to this create good form builder method. You can update the documentation here and pass it as default value to create form builder. Okay? So now, obviously, everywhere that we use this create good form builder method, we will have an error that the required parameter is missing. So let's go create form. Before we set up a new data array and passed it to set data. We don't need this anymore because we will pass an object. So we can just remove that code. And instead of passing the array to the form, we can now pass, for example, a new good instance. The default values will be taken from the properties in that good instance. So if we go to the browser, open the form, then you see there is no default values. But we can go to the good instance, Now it's working. Change, for example, the price per ton to 10. Refresh the page, and you see there's a different price per ton now. So it's taking the default values directly from the model, since we pass a new good instance in the controller. So here we create a new good instance in create form. We pass it to the form builder, and the form builder is extracting the data from there. And for the edit form, we are doing the same thing, but instead of creating a new good, we will take the existing good. Again, we can remove all that code that is constructing the array, just delete it, and instead pass the good. And especially if you have a lot of fields in a form, you can imagine that that's a lot less code than to construct the complete array with always calling the getters manually, right? Let's see what happens now. The data is taken from the existing good, and the form builder accesses all the getters to read the data. You can verify that by, for example, going to the good, going to some getter, and modifying the getter. We could, for example, multiply the return value of the getter and see what happens in the form. As you see, you will receive the multiplied return value as well. And it's very useful if you have fields that don't exist as properties in your object. So for example, if you have a price per ton, and then you have a price per ton in, I don't know, euros. You can do exactly that, assuming that this is cents or some kind of a cent currency. You can add a setter and a getter for a different property. Of course, that must be a division. And you can use these setters and getters in your form without having a different property for them, right? Underneath, it's modifying the existing price per ton property, but in the form will use the setter and the getter. Let's try to do that. I told you before we can use the property path method option to use a different property than the field's name. Until we will use price per ton in euros. And again, it will use set price per ton in euros and get price per ton in euros. All right? So the conversion is flawed, of course. Since that is cents, when we get it, we will divide. And when we set it, we multiply. So let's set it to 20 euros, for example. Yeah, of course. Yeah, we have to update the controller because the controller is still setting the data into the good instance. So here we are still calling the setters. So we are overriding what the form is already doing. Like the form now is doing this internally. We can remove the call to set name and set price per ton. And the same for the create action. We can remove the call to good is new good, but instead we call form get data, remove the setters. And as I told you before, the form is now creating a new good instance and calling the setters. And we just need to take that good instance from the form and persist it with doctrine. If you want to follow along on your own computer, you can do git checkout force task to complete and read the code, the finished code of the task. All right? Okay, so now we modified the form to update an object. We also introduced that custom setter. I will try that again. Now see, it's 2,000 credits because it's using the set price per ton in euros, which internally is applying some business logic, in this case just multiplying by 100. And if we display the form, it's also using get price per ton in euros, which is applying the division and displaying the price in euros instead of cents. All right? And by converting the form into an object-based form, we could reduce a lot of code. But we still have the same flexibility of using any kind of method in the domain model that we want to use. All right? And that's it. Did any of you think about the differences between array-based and object-based forms? What are the drawbacks and the advantages of each of them? Any ideas? Which one has less code? The object-based has, that's actually working, yeah. The object-based form has less code, that's true. Is there any disadvantage to that as well? Any comments? Just shout out. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so basically what he was saying is that you are a little less flexible. You can, for example, if you want to set some field just in a specific condition and not all the time, you can't do this. You don't have that flexibility anymore because all the setters are called internally. You have some flexibility because you can map to different properties, but you can't do additional logic like in the form layer. You can just do the logic in the good class, but not in the form layer. Like if a condition is true, then set the field, otherwise set a different, or call this setter, or otherwise call different setter, stuff like that. Doesn't work anymore in the object-based form. It's less code, but it's also less flexible since it has to take assumptions. All right? And in which cases would you use array-based forms? Even though they're longer. For example, yeah, when you don't have a database to store it, could be. Any other ideas? Shut up.
Probably when you have a drop down that is not part of the form. Basically, when you have a form or when you have a drop down, for example, for a price, that is not part of the form, but has to be recalculated later on. And then you can just dynamically set the price using different setters that are actually unique for the selected option of the drop-down.
Yeah, good point. Any other ideas? When would you use an array-based form? So one very classic example is if you don't have objects, if you have a database, but you're just accessing the raw database and you don't have any object mapper like Doctrine. You're just calling a query, SQL query, you receive an array of data, you could pass that array directly to the form and do the same thing when you update the database, right? So both ways have their advantages and disadvantages. It always depends on the situation. Any questions? Okay, so let's continue. We can check out task 2 complete, which will just contain the code that we wrote, more or less. Let's continue. So right now you saw that we stored all the code for constructing a form in the controller. That's some duplication, and it's especially a duplication if you need a form in different controllers, right? If you have a login form, for example, and you need the login form in different places, like once in the header of the page and once in the center on a different page or whatever. Then it's useful to extract all the form construction logic and decouple it from the controller. So right now, we're doing something like that. We have the controller. We call all these methods on the form builder. We pass the options. We pass the good. We call all that stuff. It's very highly coupled form code in the controller. And ideally, we want to move most of the code here to somewhere else and do something like this. Now we have the edit action. We just create a form. We have a so-called form type for a specific form. The form type defines how a form is built. And we pass that type when we create the form. We also pass the data of the form, the good instance, and then we just pass a few options to configure the form and to pass the information that we only have in the controller, like the target URL, the method to submit the form, and maybe some custom option to configure some things dynamically. For example, here we can add a custom option to configure the label, like the text of the submit button, so that in new action, for example, it could be create, and in edit action, it would be update, something like that. Okay? The methods, or like the code for constructing the form that we had here, will be moved to a good type class. And the good type extends abstract type, which is basically just an implementation of the interface form type interface with a few empty methods. It's just abstract type helps you to not implement all of the methods that are in the interface, but just the ones that you need. One of them is required. It's called getName. It returns some string name of the form type that can be used instead of doing new good type. For example, when you call add and you want to add a field or a form of a custom type to an existing form. So before, you remember, we had add name of type text, add submit or create of type submit. All these types that were passed in the second argument are actually form type classes, and the strings that we pass are the names of these types. The second important method that we specify in most of our types is called setDefaultOptions. You remember that we passed the data class option to create form builder before? We can use this method to set the defaults for some options or to override them. So for example, data class option should be deep space 1 game bundle entity good. We can do that. We receive an options resolver that is just a helper class to set the requirements for our options. So we can say that the default value of the data class option should be entity good, and then there should be another option that is called submit label, which should be required. That means if you create a form of that type and you don't pass that option, there should be an error. And there are a couple of other helper methods on the options resolver that help you to specify options and to validate them. For example, you can validate that the submit label option must be a string, or yeah, for example, or that data class must contain an existing class name, something like that. Okay? So that's setDefaultOptions. And here we see we can at the same time override existing options and specify our custom options using this options resolver. And then the third and most important method that we have in most of our form types is called buildForm. That's basically doing the same thing that we had in our controller. This time we're receiving a form builder, the same object that we had in the controller when we did create form builder. We received the form builder and we received the options that were used to construct the form, and then we just configure the form builder in the same way that we did in the controller. And we can use, for example, our custom submit label options here to configure the label of the submit button. You probably also remember that there were some more options that we passed in the controller before. There was the action option and the method option, and we're not doing anything here with them. The reason for that is that Symfony is already providing these options internally. I will show you later on how that works. And Symfony is already using these options and calling set action and set method on the builder for us. So all we have to do is the real custom business logic that is specific to our application here. And now, as I showed you before, in the controller, we can just construct a new good type here, pass the options, and everything else stays as before. So as you probably assumed, the next task would be to take all the code of the good form that we have so far, move it into a custom type, create a new good type class. The good type class needs 3 methods: getName, which returns the string name of the good; setDefaultOptions, which sets the data class option that we set in the controller before, which adds a custom option if you want. You don't have to do that. And buildForm. Here you can basically just copy the code from the controller for adding the different fields. The good type class belongs under, by default, you can put it anywhere you want, but by default it belongs under the form namespace of the Deep Space 1 game bundle. You see that there is already a different type, so you can check out that type. The ship class type should already be there. You can just look at it. Good type will be very similar. And then make sure to use the create, instead of create form builder, use create form in your controller, pass the good type, and pass the different configuration parameters via the options. how to solve this task. So as most of you did, we need to create a new type class in the form namespace or anywhere that you want, but I'm keeping them in the form namespace here, in this example. I'll call it good type. We'll extend the abstract type class. And here PHP Storm is even warning us that there is a method missing, which is getName. We can return a name. Usually it's good to prefix the name with some kind of namespace that you use, otherwise there's the risk that you have a collision with different bundles. So what we can do here is, for example, use deepspace1_good as name, because the names must be unique within the form system. Then we will override the method setDefaultOptions. The call to parent setDefaultOptions is not really required because it's just an empty stub. So we can just remove it. And as before, in the controller, we have to set the data class option, but this time we do it in the form type. And we also define a custom option submit label that will be required. I'm doing this here to show that there is different ways of specifying options. So if we pass the name submit label, this option, to set required, then the user will have to pass that option when he's constructing the form. Instead of set required, you could also pass it to set defaults and give it a default value. In this case, the option is optional. You can set it if you want, otherwise the default submit is used. I will show later on what happens if you don't pass that option. And the last method that we will add is build form. Again, the call to parent build form is optional, as there's no code inside in the parent class. And here we can just copy all the code from the controller and call it in the type instead. And we also want to add the submit button here. Add submit of type submit and set the label to the submit label option. So here in set default options, we configure which options need to be passed and the default values. And here in build form, we receive the options that were passed and can use them to configure the form. Otherwise, the code is the same as we had in the controller before. Now, if we go to the controller, we can remove a lot of code. We can remove create good form builder because all of that is now done in the type. And here in create form and create edit form, we can replace that call to create good form builder and instead call create form. If we use some kind of IDE, it will indicate that we first need to set the type. So we say new good type. The second argument is the data, which is, for example, a new good instance for the create form, and then an array of options. The options we use here are action, which is the equivalent of set action before, and submit label, which is the option that we defined ourselves. So you see that we could remove a lot of code from that create form method, and we could also remove an entire additional method by just moving it to a type. And we can do the same thing in create edit form. We just need to update the action to use goods update instead of goods create. And instead of passing a new good instance, we pass the existing good instance. We can also update the submit label to update. And it's important not to forget to set the method to put. And if we try that, this shouldn't be too different from before. We have the name update here. And if we add a new one, that's create. And now we can experiment a bit with the methods of the options resolver. For example, if we leave away the submit label option here, I'll just comment it out when we create a new form. We'll receive an exception. The required option submit label is missing because you passed it to set required. So if you find out that actually you can set it to a reasonable default value, you can pass it to set defaults instead of set required, and set some default value for that option, that custom option. If we reload, you see that the value or the name of the submit button is submit now, which is the default value. Being a default value, it means we can still, of course, override the default value in the controller. So we can still set it to create. As you see, that's a very flexible system to customize your types, to make them configurable by adding custom options and making them required or setting a default value, etc. Are there any questions about this so far? So before we are having a lunch break, I will just make a few more comments on types. So the first bullet is complete. We moved the good form to a new good type. Then the second thing, we didn't work on that yet. We can do it afterwards if you want, or we can skip it. It's possible to register the good type in Symfony's service container. If we do that, we can use the type's name in the controller. So right now, we had to do new good type when we created the form. If we want to do deep space one good here, then we have to actually register the type in the service container. The same is true if we want to use the type for, if you, for example, have a bigger form and we embed the good form in that bigger form, then we would do something like add good new good type. That's the same thing. And again, if we want to specify the custom type a string, we need to configure it in the service container. That's very simple. You can actually check out the code of services YAML, and there you will see the registration of the ship class type. It's very simple. Basically, it's just copy pasting for every type that you have to register that. It's in the bundle under resources config services YAML. So that would be the second task that there was. And again, I would like you to think about the benefits and drawbacks of creating a form type instead of configuring it in the controller. Any ideas?
Reuse of code.
Yeah.
So you don't have to, well, not have a create edit form, create new form. So you have the same options, but you just specify the by option what you want to do.
Yeah, but we could do the same before. Before we had a method in the controller, and we used the same method for both forms, the new and the edit form. So it's the same thing, no?
Well, and now you can, you can call the functions from other places,
Right.
other controllers.
So you can use the form in other controllers. You can also embed the form, as I showed you just now. When you have a bigger form and you want to have that form as part of the bigger form, then you can pass the type to add and embed that form into a bigger form. So it's a very simple system. You can also create types for custom HTML fields, for example, a date picker or a color picker or a calendar, or I don't know, anything. So you can not just create types for complete forms, but also for individual fields and add custom JavaScript or, I don't know, things like that. So that's a very big benefit of types. What's a drawback? When would you not use types? Sorry? Dynamic forms? Yeah, it doesn't really matter. It makes no difference. Well, one obvious drawback is that you have a lot of boilerplate code. You need to create a new good type class. You need to specify all these methods that are just required for making a type, right? So it's more code than we actually had in the controller. So if we don't need to reuse the type, it's maybe not worth it to create a new custom type. In very small projects that we need to create quickly, hack together, that's probably unnecessary. And one interesting thing is, one last thing that I want to mention, is the types can have parent types. So you saw that in the controller we had the options method and action. And these are magically inherited from Symfony. The reason is that the parent type of the good type is the form type. Form type basically is the default type of all types. It specifies a few custom options. If you're interested, you can open the form type class in the Symfony source code and see what's happening by default. And instead of inheriting from form, you can also inherit from other types. For example, if you want to have a custom text field, you can inherit from text here. Or a custom URL field, then you can inherit from URL here. And Symfony by default already has a rich set of types that have an inheritance structure as well. So the default type of all types is form. And then there's types inheriting from form directly, like checkbox, file, choice, which is a drop-down, date, date time. Date time actually consists of a date field and a time field, text, and then we have a few more fields that inherit from text, and then a few more fields that inherit from the drop-down choice. For example, country, which is a drop-down of countries, language, which is a drop-down of languages, etc. And you can do the same for your project, especially in big projects where you have a lot of types that you need to reuse, and you can create your custom types and inherit from one type, specialize it, things like that. That's it. We'll have lunch break now.